pointed to. Then there's some atmospheric things, which is the way our civic infrastructure, which is much weaker than our other 10 cities. If you listen carefully to speeches or read the newspaper, you will hear a common theme that is somebody else should do something else about this thing, meaning I call on you to do this thing. So the public sector calls on the private sector blames the government. Candidly, as a person who's sort of half in the world of philanthropy, although that's not where I come from, philanthropy tends to be a world where you are spending a fixed amount, 5% of dead people's money. So it sounds bold and imaginative, but really it's a very cautious group of people. And then community organizations, because of the way philanthropy is set up, community organizations that are doing the work every day, who are with many times with lived experience, those community organizations are pitted against each other in kind of like a Hunger Games dynamic to help elevate their neighbors out of poverty. So what you have here is a need for more and more people who are in leadership or want to see this be different to insist that we ground our actions in data, that we all feel like we would be evaluated. I've asked our board of directors at United Way to evaluate me on our ability to drive meaningful cross-sector collaboration where we can articulate a North Star that we will all be guided by and drive meaningful collective action that is less vying and more kind of aspirational towards something else that can be achieved. Because as Omar knows, other markets have challenges as we do with racism and state legislatures and other things, and yet they have managed to cooperate in a way where economic mobility and asset building is achievable.
You know, I've actually heard folks posit that we're comparing ourselves to the wrong cities. Is that any part of it? Is it that we, for whatever reason, what do we share in common with Houston? And that's the next big city, right? Isn't that the one that we're trying to catch up to with a 25%? We have a 25% poverty rate, correct? And
probably more now with COVID.
Right. And Houston has what? I know that you know this. What's their percentage poverty?
They're at 20.
Yeah. So
Omar, can I kick off this one and pass it to you?
Please.
So my perception is there are the thing that I love, and this is like, every good meeting has a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of information, and a little bit of gossip. So I'm gonna give you some more gossip as we go. The gossip for this one, for me, is I talk to folks who actually have power from all sectors. They're powerful because they know what these issues are, not academically, but they see them every day. Folks who have power because they have wealth that they could invest. You can't, and so what we're talking about here is we have to pivot from armchair analysis to leaning toward investment. You can't get folks toward a better life without sacrificial investment of your whole self in this issue. So what I always hear that I love, somebody I was talking to who is a Pew, not the family, but a person experiencing wealth, that I was talking to the other day, is like, well, if we just drew the borders of Philadelphia County differently, and we drew in about 75,000 folk who are like in Lower Merion, boom, poverty problem fixed. And they were saying that's kind of what Houston does. I mean, I could see the point, but that doesn't in any way address the languishing of lives in our neighborhoods, who we are going to become like Seattle, where we are going to be in a position where we have to import talent to be a competitive city, and we're just going to turn our backs on children in neighborhoods who are trying to achieve their piece of the American dream. So for me, the cities that we could look at where there are commonalities is there is this civic infrastructure that is aligned on the change they want to see, and they are relentless in the sense of urgency in pursuing that outcome. So I don't care if it's Houston, Charlotte, New York, Chicago, the leadership at a grassroots level and at a grass tops level has a shared sense of urgency toward an outcome that is a little bit missing here. We lead the nation in a lot of things. Like, we have the best children's hospital, I would argue. We had the first fire department, all these great things. But we also lead the nation in passive aggression, meaning we cannot have a conversation with each other about, let's do this thing. Like, let's do something different than what we have done. I don't know, Omar, what are you thinking?
What has always given me pause, Greenlight operates in 9 cities, soon to be 11 cities across the country. We have deep knowledge of the makeup of how decision-making happens, how resource allocation is made, and it varies from city to city. But one of the things I saw Chris Wink mentioned in the chat, maybe we're more akin to Rust Belt cities. Let's take a look at Cincinnati. Cincinnati has tremendous innovation capacities around collective impact, bringing the private sector, bringing higher education, bringing government around long-term common outcomes that everyone is pushing towards. In the K-12 space, in the K-16 space, as you move it to University of Cincinnati, and looking and thinking about how do you connect all of the pieces, necessary pieces of civic infrastructure, so that it's more akin to landing a plane. One of my favorite superintendents of education used to say, I wish our public education system would think like air traffic control. There is zero interest in failure, right? Success is a 0% failure rate. And the moment a plane goes down, there's national infrastructure, investigators, the best people in the world coming in to figure out what happened at the root to make sure it doesn't happen again. And there is accountability, and a lot of things happen. We need to think the same about our public systems, that a 0% failure rate, right? We should assume 100% graduation from high school, right? And assuming that 85% is good enough is not good enough. So what Bill was talking about is we do have a lack of alignment across our civic infrastructure, and it has been that way for a long, long time. But things can change. The reason why it has to change is because if there are 380 or 400,000 Philadelphians experiencing poverty, that's the size of New Orleans. If there are 200,000 Philadelphians experiencing deep poverty, living on $250 a week, that's Salt Lake City. There are 77,000 white people in Philadelphia who experience poverty. That's the size of Camden. And we don't have any infrastructures to deal with those issues at scale. And so what we'll need to do is figure out how to align our civic infrastructure to united ways, our Philadelphia foundations, our anchor institutions, both on the public sector, private sector, and nonprofit side, around big goals. What are we going to achieve over the next 5-10 years in the areas of mental health, in the areas of educational attainment, and all these other areas? Because the scale of the problem is massive. And in order to meet that scale, you have to bring together and marshal the resources necessary. And we haven't seen anything like that heretofore in Philadelphia. Some of what Bill's working on, I think, will get us there. What the city is working on will get us there. But we really need to land that plane.
You know, it's interesting because I remember a number of years ago, Judge Nelson Diaz, when he was campaigning in the primary to be mayor, he told me at one point that he was stunned by the number of people as he knocked on doors in Latino Kensington. He was stunned by the number of people who were absolutely hopeless about ever emerging from what was generational poverty at that point. So is, give us a sense of where we can find that hope.
I think we can find it in the young organizers that we've seen throughout the pandemic. I think that the next generation of organizers and leaders are not interested in addressing symptoms. They have a deep, deep belief that the underlying systems in which we live and operate are deeply flawed. And so they're not interested in small wins for the purpose of wins. They're interested in big reform, big change. And that gives me hope. There are great organizations like Yeah Philly, great organizations, Philly Tech Justice. There are so many great organizations that are headed by young people, native Philadelphians, out of North Philly, out of West Philly, out of Southwest and Northwest and Northeast, that believe that Philadelphia can be better, and they're not willing to wait. And so what gives me hope, while I gave you those numbers and the scale is massive, the young people that in Philadelphia now are seeking to solve big problems, big challenges. And we should get behind them and support them as much as possible. And that's what gives me hope in face of some of those numbers and in face of some of the hopelessness that you feel. Many people know, similar to Nelson, I went and knocked on doors too in a campaign, and I heard the same thing. But what I also saw were young people that said enough is enough. And if no one else is going to do anything, we will. And that gives me hope going forward.
I would say, just to add, I agree with Omar. There's a couple things here that are like really tough to kind of say, but here's the first issue is, given my background, I would say there are 3 topics that are hyper democratic, meaning everyone can offer an opinion without anybody checking you for lack of doing your homework. And that is religion, politics, and poverty. And I happen to dabble in all 3 of those. Meaning, if you got up on a forum that Sabrina, you hosted and said, today we're going to host a conversation about the threats posed by North Korea. And the person we're going to be speaking to about that today is Bill Golderer, a Presbyterian minister from Center City who is interested or has thoughts about North Korea. I don't know anything about North Korea. But I want to tell you what I know about it. In this conversation, folk who are in the struggle know more than any of us. So that's the first thing that's different in other cities. Like, there is a way to be proximate to the struggle because there's a lot of opinions. Most people in poverty in Philadelphia are working a couple jobs, and so getting curious about what we think we know and what is actually so. This goes back to the data conversation and listening deeply to that happens in other markets. The second piece that is again to Omar's point, I've had very painful conversations with folks in the private sector, and this is going to get me in trouble. But folks are like, we really don't want to give you any money or resources. We'd like to give you volunteers for like a day. And I'm like, you cannot. If your neighbor came to your house, someone that you know, and said, I'm really struggling to stabilize my family in COVID, and I have to choose between food and electricity, you wouldn't say, why don't I not come by tomorrow and see how you're doing volunteering? What they're asking for is investment in a situation that is a crisis. So we cannot be in the mindset that our reversal of fortune on this topic is going to require anything other than sacrificial investment. And I've always said, how do you present folks with a proposition that is not attractive? This is going to be costly, and it's going to take longer than any of us want it to take. And yet, if you're really serious about Philadelphia becoming this world-class city as we approach our 250th anniversary, we would want to answer the question, that the American dream is attainable and viable for everyone who lives here. And that would be a promise I would want to fulfill were we able to marshal that kind of, and I don't want to wait for the next generation, but maybe.
So somebody messaged me a question that says, some data suggests that more philanthropy comes from conservative and Republican donors than from others, which impacts how money is spent. Data also suggests that 501c4 organizations find loopholes in supporting efforts that have nothing to do with real social welfare. What types of reforms are needed in the philanthropic sector to address how these issues impact poverty?
I can only tell you that specifically to that data around Republican or conservative funding of 501c3, C4s, that is born out of a long-term 25-year strategy to change narrative, to shift discussion, to shift framing, and to engage on a wide range of topics with a lens that is an ideological one, right? So there's a couple of things you could do, right, to reform that. You could reform the system to say, hey, in areas where there's direct ideology, I don't think you can get away with that. I think what others have tried to do, let's say on the left side or more big D Democratic side, is to try to build up those infrastructures as well, but they're not as well funded, and they don't have as long of a view. Mm-hmm. So what the Republican and the conservative movement has done is build a movement and an infrastructure through those investments. It's actually something we should learn from. I'm not talking about being a Democrat. I'm talking about individuals who care about reducing poverty, eliminating poverty. When you put into place a structure, a pipeline, and long-term champions who are going to Bill's point, sacrificial investment, they might not see any social or financial return for 20 years, but they're building something, right? That 20 years later, 25 years later, will have real resonance, real power, and real relevance. I think we're beginning to see some of that now in our politics. So I would say we actually might need to replicate some of what has happened, which is a long-term view, building structures that have common outcomes and shared. And there's a broad table that sits and determines these investments and determines these plans. And we have to build a table similarly for those of us in this city and across the state who care about the eradication of poverty, particularly deep poverty, particularly among marginalized communities, particularly communities of color.
Before we proceed, I just want to let people know, you probably saw that a poll popped up and covered Omar's face for a few minutes. Please, feel free to answer the poll, and we'll let you know what the trends in that are. So tell me who's doing it right, folks. What organizations should we be really aware of that we might not be, that are really doing the work to eradicate poverty in new ways? Or what policies should we be looking at?
I'm always someone who, our grantees, Greenlight's portfolio, we have 5 organizations over the last 5 years that we've invested in $4.2 million. We've leveraged $18 million and follow-on public and other private philanthropic capital to help them grow and scale. Those organizations, Year Up, Single Stop, Center for Employment Opportunities, Parent Child Plus, and Compass Working Capital. That portfolio, if you go to greenlightfund.org/Philadelphia, you can take a look and drill down. Those are organizations that the models may have come from other places, but they're connected in with local nonprofit infrastructure. And so it's allowing local nonprofits to scale evidence-based models in innovative ways. And really proud of those organizations in particular. You asked us a question about specific policy you'd like to see implemented. Policy, yes, but more vision, and hopefully policy would be able to help manifest it. 100% of individuals experiencing poverty should be able to access and have and get the public assistance, the programs they're eligible for, within 30 days of finding out that they're eligible for it. An example of this could be FAFSA, financial aid. We have data by high school in Philadelphia that tells you the percentage of students that have completed it. FAFSA completion is an indicator of college access, of college persistence and completion, right? Strawberry Mansion had a 37% completion rate, while Masterman had a 99% completion rate. So the law of the city should be 100% of kids should be filling out the FAFSA, period. And other cities have done this, other states have done this. There's a movement around this. That's an example of ways to make sure dollars are getting to families that need it, those financial aid dollars. But replace FAFSA. It could be the child care subsidy. It could be WIC. It could be SNAP, right? And anyone who isn't getting the services they're eligible for should get them. And it should not be on them to find it. It should be on government and the nonprofit sector to make sure that they access it and get it. And going forward, that is a low lift way to use dollars and get dollars into the pockets of Philadelphians that's already been allocated. We're not trying to raise more. We're not trying to find more. Just trying to make sure folks get access to the dollars that they deserve and they're eligible for. So big picture policy, that'd be an area.
Bill, we're almost at time, but I'd like you to respond to that. But let me just tell you folks, before we get to we go to breakout session, there are a number of people who have posed questions on the chat, and there seems to be a lot of interest. So if you would like to share your where they can get more information from you, that would be terrific. But Bill, okay, so programs, policies, where do we go?
So this is a theory of change, where you ground yourself in the data and you ask a question, and then there needs to be a mindset change. So I'm going to elevate Detroit, right? And Kellogg is Battle Creek, Michigan, has nothing to do with Detroit. They only, for 100 years, their foundation and philanthropic interest was children, inviolate children, because children is an uncontroversial topic. I mean, great. Then literally you wake up one day and the Detroit Free Press says, Detroit's bankrupt. And Kellogg, I met the president, the family member, who said, well, I don't know if it's going to make sense for us to keep funding education and not pay attention to the enterprise of business in Detroit. And so it's the reality is, and I've taken several field trips out there with many actors to say, it was a 5-year journey where that decision that we're not going to only do what we've always done and be satisfied with the returns on that, they said we're going to make investment in basically African American enterprise. That's what we're going to do. Small business. I could tell you, I won't take up too much time. I will tell you 5 years later, instead of a lot of our workforce initiatives in this town are what I would call artisanal, like 5 people at a time get jobs. The Detroit program of basically the entrepreneurs of color ecosystem that they built over 5 years has led to 78,000 living wage jobs by trusting that people can move from idea to open and thrive and make good on their loans and employ people in neighborhoods through the barbershop collective, and I will tell you, I selfishly have been bringing people out there with this idea that we absolutely cannot tolerate a city with 44% African American citizenry and 2% African American owned enterprise. That is absolutely mathematically impossible were it not for racist lending practices. There is no other explanation. And that's fine. We can acknowledge that and admit that. And then in my other world, repent and do something different and marshal capital and prove it at a pilot level and then make it policy. And so someone in the tech audience, if you want to contact me later, I would like to know if there's anybody who wants to help me work on. There are a lot of corporate pronouncements about millions and billions and zillions of dollars that are going to go toward Black enterprise, I would like to check the receipts on that and where any of that money's going, because I haven't seen it. And if any of y'all, if you have some algorithm where we could like check that, because I think you get the press release, but nobody follows up and says, because Mike Banks, who works on the team at United Way, he was the president and CEO of the African American Chamber of Commerce for Philly, New Jersey, and Delaware, and he can't get anybody on the phone but the PR department. So I'm just saying, like, there's an issue in our market about saying this is an untenable reality. Detroit, does anyone think Detroit is a better city than this place? I mean, look at their sports teams. They're horrible. So like, if they can do it with less people, less money, and less, I mean, frankly, and they did it. So why are we content with our current reality? I'll close with this. The moment when we can confidently reverse what Richardson Dilworth said in 1924, who was the mayor then, Republican, was Philadelphia will never claim its rightful place on the world stage until it reverses its reality that it is corrupt and content.
Omar and Bill, thank you so much. It's always so interesting to speak with you both, and I'm really grateful for the conversation. For those of you who are going into breakout sessions, just a quick reminder that you should turn on your video now, because if you wait to turn it on in the breakout session, you won't be able to. But please join me in thanking Omar and Bill. And soon we will be in